He was cleaning his grandfather's attic and stumbled upon an old camera hidden under a floorboard. He didn't know that inside was film that his grandfather had kept for 60 years. When he saw the last photos, it became clear. The truth had been right above his head all along. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are viewing from. Daniel Harris had always believed that memory was an unreliable thing, shifting and reshaping itself with time, softening the sharp edges of grief and sharpening the details one wished to forget. Yet as he stood before his grandfather's old house, weather-beaten, withdrawn, and strangely expectant, he felt that memory, however fragile, was all he had. The wind pressed against the sagging porch roof, making it groan the same way it had when he was a boy. It was a lonely sound, the kind that carried across empty fields and made a place feel older than its wood or stone. He had not been here in more than a decade, not since the quiet funeral where his grandfather Oliver had been laid to rest, with barely a whisper from the small town he had spent his entire life serving. People remembered him as a kind man, a brilliant engineer in his day, and a widower who had never quite recovered from losing his wife. No one ever spoke ill of him or questioned his privacy. They accepted the silence around him, the way some people accept a locked door. Better, left closed. Safer, untouched. Daniel stepped onto the porch and felt the wood shift under his weight. The key turned with surprising ease, as if the lock had been waiting for this moment. Inside, the house greeted him with a stale breath, the smell of closed rooms, old paper, and the faint metallic tang of tools left unused for too long. Dust clung to every surface, soft layers that muffled the corners of furniture and the edges of door frames. The air was cooler than he remembered. Light squeezed through narrow cracks in the shutters, falling in thin, hesitant lines over the wooden floorboards. He moved slowly, taking in each familiar shape. His grandfather's armchair, which still held the faint indentation of a man who had spent his evenings reading. The oval mirror on the wall with a crack running through its lower corner. The neatly arranged coat rack by the door, as though Oliver might return at any moment. But what unsettled Daniel most was the stillness. It was not simply the quiet of an empty house. It was a quiet that suggested something unfinished, some last breath caught between walls that had been waiting years to let it go. He walked deeper into the house, past the small kitchen where his grandmother once hummed while slicing apples for pies, past the hallway, lined with photographs so old they had browned around the edges. Many of them were unfamiliar Stern ancestors, a few soldiers in uniform, a family portrait taken during the Depression. Oliver was in several pictures, younger, sharper, with the same serious eyes Daniel had inherited, but did not realize, until this moment, were the exact same shade of gray. In the living room, newspapers lay on a low table, yellowed and curling, dated a decade past. The mundane details of Oliver's life were frozen in place, as if the house itself had refused to move forward once he was gone. Daniel set down his backpack and inhaled deeply. This visit was not voluntary sentimentality. The house was now legally his, and with the mounting property taxes, he needed to decide whether to sell it, keep it, or restore it. But even as he tried to frame his task in practical terms, the weight of the place pressed on him. Something here was different, something he hadn't noticed as a boy, a subtle tension in the air, a sense of purpose beneath the dust. He moved toward the narrow staircase that led to the attic, the place Oliver had always forbidden him to enter. Just old junk, his grandfather used to say. Nothing but bad lungs and splinters up there. But Daniel had always sensed the firmness behind the words, the unspoken insistence that the attic was not merely uninteresting, but off-limits. As a child, he obeyed. As an adult, he felt a prickling curiosity he couldn't quite justify. The steps creaked under his feet as he ascended, The air grew cooler and denser, tinged with that old attic smell of age and abandonment. When he pushed open the hatch, a cloud of dust lifted, catching in the faint light that seeped through the small dormer window. The space stretching before him seemed larger than he remembered. The roof beams formed a cage above his head, littered with cobwebs. Boxes were stacked in uneven rows, their labels faded. A workbench stood against the far wall, surprisingly organized. Chisels sorted by size, measuring tools aligned with precise care, old drafting pencils arranged in a straight line, as if someone had used them yesterday. Daniel walked toward the workbench, drawn by its unusual tidiness. His grandfather had always been methodical, but this arrangement felt deliberate in a different way, like a station set for ongoing work that someone had been forced to abandon suddenly. He ran his hand over the surface, feeling tiny shavings of wood and the coldness of metal tools. Beneath a stack of rolled papers, he found a notebook, its leather cover worn to softness. Inside were sketches. Blueprints, intricate lines, and measurements, marked with his grandfather's distinct handwriting. Yet the labeled components meant nothing to him. They were not household projects or furniture designs. They resembled corridor layouts and ventilation structures, diagrams that matched nothing about the small house he stood in. An unease settled into him, and without fully knowing why, he turned around, scanning the attic. Something else was wrong. A large old trunk rested near the center of the room, one he remembered from childhood. But now he noticed the way it sat. Unusually rigid, too anchored. When he tried to slide it aside, it barely budged. That alone wasn't entirely surprising. It was a heavy piece of furniture. But when he knelt and inspected the floor beneath it, a detail captured his attention. One of the floorboards, positioned directly under the trunk's corner, was slightly raised. Just a few millimeters, barely visible to the eye, but enough to make him pause. Carefully, he levered his fingers under the trunk's edge and rocked it gently until he managed to shift it just enough to expose the board. Dust scattered as the wood groaned. When the trunk was out of the way, he crouched and brushed away debris around the raised plank. His pulse quickened as he realized the board wasn't simply loose. It was meant to be removed. The edges were worn smooth from use, not rot. He slid the board aside, revealing a dark cavity framed in steel. His breath caught. Built into the floor was a square metal vault, heavy and solid, with a mechanical combination lock. Its surface was cold when he touched it, colder than the surrounding air. He instinctively reached for the notebook he'd found earlier. The combination wouldn't be printed plainly, he knew that much. But as he inspected the pages more carefully, he discovered a faded inscription on the inside of the back cover. Tiny numbers pressed into the leather. The moment he saw them, something deep inside him shifted, as though he had crossed a threshold he did not know existed until now. Hand slightly trembling, he entered the numbers into the lock. The dial clicked precisely, almost eagerly, as though the vault recognized the code after years of silence. When he lifted the heavy door, the hinges moaned in protest, releasing a whisper of cold, stale air from within. Inside, everything had been packed carefully, preserved as though the vault were less a safe and more a shrine. Papers tied with twine, metal instruments wrapped in cloth, letters sealed but never sent. And in the center lay a leather case. Daniel removed it with reverence, his heartbeat steady in his ears, and unzipped the flap just enough to see what lay inside. The camera was immaculate, a vintage Zeiss icon from the 1950s, polished, pristine, impossibly well kept. Daniel had never seen his grandfather with a camera. In fact, Oliver had always shied away from photographs. The contradiction hit him like a whisper of warning. He lifted the camera, feeling its weight, and with careful fingers opened the back. A roll of undeveloped film lay inside, its edges brittle with age, yet intact. He replaced the camera gently, closed the vault door, and lowered himself to the attic floor. Everything inside him had changed. His grandfather, the man he thought he knew, the quiet, withdrawn engineer whose silence seemed harmless, had left behind something that felt undeniably significant. The film could contain anything. Family memories, meaningless snapshots, or something he couldn't even imagine. He couldn't stay in the house any longer. The air around him felt charged, almost watchful. He secured the camera in his backpack, replaced the floorboard and the trunk, and hurried downstairs, the house creaking in response to his movements, as though alerting him that he was waking something that had slept far too long. Minutes later, he was driving through the quiet streets toward the next town, where an old photography specialist still ran a small lab capable of developing vintage film. The man behind the counter accepted the camera with an arched brow, commenting that he hadn't seen one like it in years. When Daniel asked how long the development might take, the man hesitated, studying the film as though it carried a story. "A week," he finally said. "Maybe less if the film holds. There's no telling with something this old." Daniel nodded, thanked him, and stepped back outside. The sun was setting, painting the edges of the sky in pale orange. Yet the world felt dimmer than it should have, as if the film, still unprocessed, cast a shadow ahead of him. As he walked toward his car, he felt the first real ripple of fear. Whatever secrets the attic held had been buried for decades. And now, for reasons he could not yet understand, they were beginning to rise. He started the engine, keeping his eyes fixed on the road, though the weight of the unknown clung to him like a second skin. A week from now, he would return for the photographs. A week from now, he might uncover the truth. And as he drove back toward the silent house that had belonged to Oliver Harris, he couldn't shake the certainty that the past was already turning toward him, ready to speak at last. The week that followed unfolded with a tension so constant and so tightly coiled that Daniel often found himself pacing the empty rooms of the house without realizing when he had begun. The silence inside those walls no longer felt passive. It pressed at him, nudging memories to the surface, making him notice things he had ignored for years. He spent his days sorting through dusty drawers, stacks of brittle receipts, and bundles of unopened letters, trying to distract himself from the anticipation gnawing at him. But no matter how many boxes he opened, or how many corners he dusted, his mind kept circling back to the attic. The cold vault, the leather case, the undeveloped roll of film that had slept in darkness for 60 years. At night, sleep came in fragments, threaded with uneasy dreams. In one, he stood again before the opened vault, but instead of tools and documents, he saw his grandfather's young face, staring back at him from inside the metal box, expressionless, waiting. In another, he found himself holding the developed photographs, but every image was blurred except for a single figure standing in the corner of each frame. Daniel always woke before he could see the figure's face. 6 days after he delivered the film, he received a call from the photo lab. The voice on the other end was the same man who had taken the camera, but something in his tone had changed. He spoke quietly, almost reluctantly, as if he were handing off a responsibility that had weighed on him. "Your photos are ready," he said. "You might want to come soon." Daniel drove to the next town with a sensation that felt like descending into deep water, each passing mile drawing him further from the safety of ignorance. The day was overcast, the kind of gray where the sky pressed low against the earth, heavy and mute. He parked near the small shop, hesitated for a moment with his hands resting on the steering wheel, and finally forced himself to get out. The bell above the shop door jingled faintly as he entered. The photographer looked up, his expression strained in a way Daniel could not interpret. Without a word, the man produced a thick white envelope sealed with tape. But as he handed it over, he paused and seemed to search for something to say. "These are unusual," he murmured. I won't say more, but I can tell you that your grandfather must have taken them carefully. Very carefully." The words lingered, and Daniel left the shop feeling as though he carried something far heavier than a packet of photographs. Outside, he stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, feeling the cool air against his face, listening to the muted sounds of traffic from the nearby street. His hands trembled faintly as he broke the seal. The first photograph slid into view, black and white, blurred slightly at the edges, but still crisp enough to make out. It was a picture of the house, his family's house, as it had looked decades ago, freshly painted, surrounded by young trees that had long since grown tall and tangled. A younger Oliver stood on the porch, sleeves rolled, leaning casually against the railing. His expression was relaxed, even content. Daniel stared at it intensely, trying to reconcile this vibrant, confident man with the quiet, withdrawn grandfather he had known. The next several photographs were similarly harmless. Family members he vaguely recognized from stories, gatherings he had never attended, landscapes of parks and streets that looked almost foreign now. They were echoes of a life Daniel had never participated in, glimpses into a world that had existed long before he was born. Yet something about them seemed deliberate posed, maybe, or arranged with unusual care. The angles were precise. The subjects always seemed unaware they were being photographed, as though Oliver had been documenting something rather than capturing memories. Daniel shifted slightly and continued through the stack. The tone of the images changed abruptly after the 10th photograph. The next one was a close-up of a technical blueprint, the lines crisp and neat, illuminated by a single bulb overhead. Daniel recognized his grandfather's handwriting, marking small measurements along the edges. He turned to the next photo. Another blueprint, different from the first, detailed with arrows pointing toward narrow corridors and heavy doors. He frowned, trying to understand. These were not casual snapshots. These were records, technical, meticulous, and unmistakably confidential. He flipped to the next photo and felt a cold sensation slide down his spine. It was an interior of a narrow hallway with thick reinforced walls. A vault door stood at the end, massive and circular. The photograph was taken from a low angle, as if shot quickly or covertly. His breath caught. He recognized this. Everyone in the state did. It looked exactly like the old Treasury Building's vault. The same vault that had been at the center of the most famous unsolved robbery in the region's history. The robbery that had occurred nearly 60 years earlier. The robbery in which more than $2 million had vanished without a trace. Daniel turned to another photograph. It showed the interior of the vault room, the arrangement of pillars and lighting that matched the descriptions he remembered reading years ago out of idle curiosity. The next photo displayed a map of the Treasury's security patrol schedule, with the paths marked in thick pencil. The photo after that showed a narrow service tunnel, its walls lined with brick and old electrical wiring, the floor uneven and damp, a pressure built behind his ribs. His hands grew cold. He had started breathing too quickly without noticing. He continued turning pages, but each photograph unsettled him more. There were plans for ventilation shafts, points where alarms could be bypassed, the timing of guard rotations, and notes that looked to be written by multiple hands. And then, after a sequence of tunnel photographs, the nature of the images grew darker still. The next image captured a dimly lit room. In the center were at least a dozen large duffel bags, bulky and bulging with rectangular shapes, unmistakably resembling stacks of cash. The lighting made it difficult to determine how much money lay inside, but the number of bags alone spoke volumes. Daniel's stomach tightened. He could hear his pulse pounding in his ears. He turned to the final sequence of photographs, already knowing, already fearing what he would see. The second to last image showed 4 men standing in what appeared to be the same dim room. 3 of them wore masks. Their clothing was rugged, practical. Their postures suggested planning, urgency, preparation. The fourth man had no mask, and Daniel knew him instantly. It was Oliver Harris. Younger, sharper, eyes hard with determination or fear. Daniel could not tell. He stared at the photograph until his vision blurred. He could not reconcile what he saw with the man he had known, the man who had raised him with gentle patience and quiet wisdom. The man who never raised his voice, who spent his twilight years alone, tending to a garden that never seemed to flourish. What was he doing there? How was he involved? Why had he taken these photographs? And what did it mean that he had hidden this film in a vault beneath the attic floor? Daniel forced himself to look at the final image. It was a close-up of Oliver's face. He was glancing sideways, not at the camera, but at something, or someone, just out of frame. His jaw was clenched, his eyes reflecting something Daniel couldn't decipher. Resignation, perhaps, or conflicted resolve. The background was too dark to make out details, but the faint outline of duffel bags was visible behind him. When Daniel finally lowered the photographs, his hands felt numb. His mind churned with half-formed thoughts, impossible theories that collided and shattered before they could settle. Everything he had ever believed about his grandfather, his values, his principles, the quiet integrity he had carried with him, seemed to fracture under the weight of these images. He didn't remember taking out his phone. He didn't remember dialing 911. But he found himself speaking to the dispatcher, his voice strangely detached, as he reported that he had found evidence connected to a decades-old federal robbery. He gave his location, answered questions mechanically, and hung up. The police arrived within minutes. 2 detectives stepped out, their expressions focused in a way that told Daniel they understood the gravity of what he had discovered. They ushered him inside, asked to see everything, and examined the photographs with clinical precision. One of the detectives, a gray-haired man with sharp eyes, paused for a long moment over the image of Oliver. "How long ago did your grandfather pass away?" he asked quietly. 10 years, Daniel murmured. The detective nodded slowly, processing. Then he turned to his partner and exchanged a glance that carried unspoken meaning. "You've just opened a door we never thought we'd see opened," the detective said. "This case has been cold longer than most of our careers. If these photos are genuine, and they look genuine, this changes everything." They questioned Daniel for an hour, not aggressively, but with a depth that made it clear how significant his discovery was. When they finally left, taking the photographs for forensic analysis, the house felt different. Its silence felt warmer, or perhaps more attentive, as if acknowledging that one of its long-buried secrets had finally been brought into the open. But the questions remained, clinging to Daniel long after the detectives drove away. Had Oliver been part of the heist? Had he helped plan it? Or had he been documenting it for another reason entirely? Something darker, more complicated. As night settled over the house, Daniel felt the pieces of his grandfather's life rearranging themselves around him, like a puzzle he was only beginning to understand. One truth settled slowly into his mind, heavy and certain. Whatever his grandfather had done 60 years ago, it had haunted him ever since. And now, that haunting had passed to Daniel. The night after the detectives left, pressed heavily on the house, settling into its corners as though it had finally been given permission to breathe again after decades of holding itself rigid. Daniel lay awake in the small bedroom where he had once slept as a child, staring at the ceiling while moonlight carved pale lines across the walls. The images he had seen refused to leave him. His grandfather's face, calm yet shadowed, familiar yet distant, floated behind his eyes each time he blinked. A dozen questions circled him like restless birds. Why had Oliver taken those photographs? Why had he kept them? And what had he intended Daniel to find all these years later? The detectives had taken the photos, but the weight of their meaning remained, pressing down on Daniel with a heaviness he could not shake. By morning, the house felt subtly changed, not brighter, not lighter, but awakened. Dust motes drifted through the quiet rooms, as if stirred by a breath that had only recently returned. Daniel moved slowly, making coffee, letting the bitter smell anchor him to something familiar. Outside, the sky had cleared into a pale blue, but the world still felt suspended, as though waiting for him to make the next move. He knew the police would be back. They had made that clear. There was more to examine, more to uncover, and more answers to chase. But Daniel felt an impulse tugging at him, something stronger than fear or confusion. The attic held more clues. The vault had only been the beginning. His grandfather had been meticulous, a man who built things with intention, who planned with precision, who hid things with strategy rather than desperation. If the plundered film had been hidden beneath the floorboards, then what else might lie hidden in the house? The blueprints in the notebook, the strange diagrams, the unspoken message in the way the tools had been arranged, they all suggested there was another layer beneath everything Daniel had already seen. He climbed the stairs to the attic once more. This time the air didn't feel merely stale. It felt weighted with anticipation, as though the house itself knew he was coming to it with new understanding. The trunk sat where he had pushed it back the day before, slightly askew now, its legs leaving fresh grooves in the dusty floor. The floorboard he had lifted seemed almost to point at him, waiting for him to continue what he had started. But instead of opening the vault again, Daniel walked to the wall where the workbench sat. His gaze swept carefully across every nail, every notch, every tool. Behind the bench was a small collection of old lamps, their cords wrapped and tied neatly. He crouched, running his hand along the baseboard, searching for anything out of place. It was then that he felt it. A faint draft, colder than the rest of the attic air, seeping through a narrow split in the wooden wall. That in itself wasn't unusual. Old houses settled and shifted, but the draft was strong and steady, far too directed to be accidental. Daniel pressed gently against the wall, and to his surprise, it flexed slightly, as though it had been mounted loosely, not secured as a structural wall should be. He stepped back, studying it, the way light fell on the paneling, the precise spacing of the boards. Most of the wall was uniform, but the section beneath the smallest window had a faint but undeniable seam running vertically down it. It reminded him of a door frame, cleverly disguised, but not perfectly. Heart quickening, he pushed again, this time harder. A soft click sounded, and then, with a reluctant groan, the disguised panel swung inward, revealing a narrow wooden staircase descending into darkness. A chill washed over him, both from the air rising from below and from the sense that he had just crossed yet another threshold his grandfather had never intended for anyone to cross lightly. He turned on his phone's flashlight and began his descent. The stairs creaked under his weight, and the air grew cooler with each step. It smelled faintly of machine oil, wood dust, and something older, perhaps time itself settling into forgotten corners. When he reached the bottom, he found himself standing in a large underground room, far more expansive than he would have imagined the foundation allowed. It was not a cellar. It was a workspace. No, an archive. The walls were lined with shelves that held boxes, binders, metal containers, and neatly wrapped bundles. It was organized with the same obsessive precision as the attic workbench, but here the scale was far greater. In the center of the room stood a metal cabinet, waist-high and secured with a latch, but no lock. Daniel approached it slowly, opened it, and saw rows of notebooks and loose papers, labeled with dates spanning several years. He opened one of the notebooks and found page after page of his grandfather's handwriting, tidy, confident, and unyielding. Each entry documented details related to engineering work, structural weaknesses in buildings, observations about public infrastructure, and coded notes referencing unnamed individuals. But then he turned to a page that made his breath hitch. "I cannot leave this," the entry began. "Not without keeping record. They think I am with them. They think I am complicit. But I must find a way to ensure that one day the truth is known." Daniel read on, eyes moving quickly but carefully, absorbing each word with growing dread. Oliver described how he had been approached by a group of men who knew his skills, men who understood the access he had as an engineer, who designed and maintained government buildings. They coerced him, not with money, but with threats. First subtle, then explicit. They knew where his wife walked, where she shopped, what time she left the house each morning. They made it clear that refusal was not an option. He had tried to alert the authorities subtly, coding warnings into documents he submitted, but they had either been ignored or intercepted. When the men planned the treasury robbery, they needed blueprints, access points, knowledge of weaknesses. Oliver had provided technical details under duress, believing he had no choice, but he had done something else. Too, something they had not anticipated. He had documented everything: photographs, diagrams, notes, maps. He had recorded the faces of the men, even those who tried to remain hidden. He had kept copies of the plans in the secret room beneath his house. He had hidden the film because he feared every other method of preserving evidence could be discovered. But the diary revealed more than facts. It revealed turmoil, regret, fear, and a quiet determination that had nothing to do with self-preservation. Oliver had written of wanting his grandson, a boy he barely knew, when he began documenting everything, to someday understand who he truly was, not a criminal, not a coward, but a man forced into an impossible position who had chosen to protect his family above all else. Daniel felt his throat tighten as he read. Every line seemed to chip away at the image he had built of his grandfather over the years, not shattering it, but reshaping it into something far more human, far more tragic, far more extraordinary. Oliver wasn't the mastermind behind the robbery. He was the unwilling key, and the camera, the film, the vault. They were all pieces of a story he had never been able to tell in life. Daniel placed the notebook aside and opened another. This one contained dates and names, aliases, notes on movements, suspicions about corruption within the police force at the time. Some entries detailed how Oliver had tried to distance himself quietly from the group, but each attempt had been met with subtle reminders of their reach. After the robbery, they had dispersed, disappearing into new identities or vanishing entirely. Oliver had expected to be silenced as well, but the group had fractured under suspicion and greed, leaving him isolated but alive. He had lived the rest of his life in near solitude, carrying his fear and guilt like invisible chains. Daniel heard footsteps, then real, not imagined, heavy, determined. The police had returned. He climbed the stairs and emerged into the attic just as the detectives stepped inside. Their eyes widened when he led them to the hidden door, their voices hushed with a combination of disbelief and respect. They descended into the secret room, taking photographs, collecting documents, and speaking in urgent tones. Daniel listened as they acknowledged that these records could finally piece together the final threads of a case that had haunted the department for decades. It didn't take long for them to act. Using the information in the diaries, they located the last surviving member of the criminal group, a man now living under a false name in another state. The arrest made headlines, reopening wounds long scarred over in the town, but offering a sense of closure to a crime that had loomed like a ghost over the community. For Daniel, the weeks that followed were a blur of interviews, hearings, statements, and late nights spent reading through his grandfather's diaries. Yet beneath the whirlwind, a quiet understanding settled into him. Oliver had not lived to see justice served, but he had planted the seeds of it. Through fear, he had resisted. Through silence, he had preserved the truth. And through Daniel, quiet, unassuming, Daniel, he had finally spoken. On the final evening before the police sealed the secret room for forensic preservation, Daniel returned alone. He walked slowly through the space, letting his fingers brush the surfaces his grandfather had once touched. The walls felt warmer now, softened by the knowledge they contained, not just secrets, but the final testament of a man who had tried to protect others at great personal cost. He climbed back to the attic and stood near the floorboard where he had first found the vault. The dying light of sunset poured through the dormer window, casting long shadows across the room. Daniel felt the weight of the past settle into him, not as a burden, but as an inheritance. A story he now carried not with shame, but with understanding. The house that had been silent for so long seemed, finally, at peace. If you want more stories, subscribe to the channel, watch the next video, and check out the others. Share this video with someone who might like it.